Hello, welcome, Native New York Tours welcome on a beautiful day in sunny New York City. We're glad to have you here. Just a little bit about Native New York Tours. We're a company that specializes in having tour guides who are former journalists, whether they be print or electronic news, and also historians and also people in the arts. We believe that when you do a story, it's not just about facts, figures, and numbers. We want the story to jump out and we want you to have fun. So that's what it's about, so hopefully you'll have fun today. Okay, you can reach us at 917-756-6120. That's 917-756-6120. My name is Dennis B. Last name is too long to spell. I'm the only Dennis B here. Native New York Tours. Well, I'm excited today. I'm excited because A, the weather is great, and B, we're in my #1 favorite place in all of New York City. We're in the West Village, Washington Square Park behind me, the arch, the iconic arch in Washington Square Park. And if I had one place to live, if I could afford it, it would be this place. I can't afford it, so I'm not living here. I'm probably not alone. I think most New Yorkers would want to live in this area, but it's spectacular. We're going to give you a highlight tour today of the West Village, of Greenwich Village. It's not going to be the whole tour because our normal West Village tour is 3 hours. So we're just going to give you bullet points, and we're going to stay on some points a little bit longer than other points, but you'll get a great idea about the West Village today and Washington Square Park and the Arch just from this highlight tour over here. There may be times I might digress and go into a little bit of another story or thread, but that's okay because like Greenwich Village and like Washington Square Park, it always keeps coming back here. We'll come back to this over and over again. So, Washington Square Park, the heart, the soul, the center of Greenwich Village, okay? It opens in the early 1800s, and you are looking at the beautiful, the iconic Washington Square Arch, which is started building in about 1890, opened in 1892, dedicated in 1895. And this was put up here as the centennial for our first president of the United States, George Washington, our first president, who, by the way, was ceremoniously given his inauguration day in New York City when New York was the capital of the United States. But I digress. Let's come back here. This is made of Tuckahoe marble. It is approximately 77 feet tall. The piers, or the stanchions, on each side are approximately 30 feet apart. And at the apex of the arch, it's about 47 feet. Now, we are standing at the base of Fifth Avenue. Fifth Avenue ends here. I'll come back to that. It didn't always end here. And the arch here, this is its permanent home. I'll come back to that. This was not always here. The two friezes, George Washington at the left, which we shortcut it. We call it George Washington at War, George Washington at Peace, George Washington commanding the troops, George Washington taking the oath of office. Those are added later. The one on the left, George Washington commanding the troops, is put in 1916 by the great architect Herman McNeil. And on the right, George Washington taking the oath of office was by the great Alexander Calder. The arch was designed by the great Stanford White. Now, if you say Stanford White to a tour guide in New York City, or an architect buff, or someone who loves New York City culture, they salivate. It's like Pavlov's dog. I mean, they get excited. Stanford White. He's left many his mark around New York City. But this was his baby, and he met an untimely death, but that's not on this tour, and that's for another time. An unexpected and untimely death, but still the great Stanford White. Fifth Avenue, as I said, I'm facing Fifth Avenue. This is the end of Fifth Avenue right here in front of the arch. It wasn't always like that. In 1958, the cars, you're going to see them making a turn here, coming and making a right turn. The cars and the traffic and the bus went right through. Come closer to me because someone's going to walk behind you. The cars went right through Washington Square Park. That stopped in 1958. So we're at the end of Fifth Avenue here, but it wasn't always like that. Coming back to the arch, well, this was not always in this position. Before this opened in 1892, it was on Fifth Avenue, 3 blocks north. And it was made of plaster and wood and highly festooned and decorated in red, white, and blue until they gathered the money and the funds to give it a permanent space and resting space where it is right now. So the arch, formerly 2 blocks up, 3 blocks up, and Fifth Avenue, the traffic used to go through over here. All right, we are back. So as I mentioned, Fifth Avenue used to come right through the park here, and buses and trucks and cars would come through the park. That ended in 1958. Fifth Avenue is the center of Manhattan, okay? And I am facing uptown north. We're looking downtown south, and there she is, our wonderful Freedom Tower, One World Trade, God rest their soul. And to the right of that is Judson Memorial Church, which has been at the forefront of civil rights movements and demonstrations for decades and decades and decades. When abortions weren't illegal, Judson Memorial Church stepped in. When there were Vietnam demonstrations, Judson Memorial Church, part of the whole thing. So this park itself has so much history. It's about 2.5 acres. So much to talk about. Again, this is a highlight tour. What a lot of people don't realize, especially the younger people, is that this is basically, virtually, a graveyard. There's about 10,000 people, different estimates, that are buried underneath Washington Square Park for different reasons. Some were immigrants who had no name or no family and they couldn't be traced back. Some were the so-called slaves, because we denoted them as slaves, so-called slaves, who on their back built this city and built this country. And the others were yellow fever epidemic that broke out in the 1800s, and there was mass burials here. So there's about approximately, different estimates, 10,000 people buried in and around this area. As a matter of fact, in early 2015, a few blocks down to my right, which is the east, the Con Ed was fixing a centuries-old pipe, and they discovered 2 vaults under the ground. Really well done, with a lot of thought and work went into these 2 vaults, connecting vaults. One had just skeletons thrown in it, and others had the coffins in it, and both were flooded. But there was a method to what people do, and they dug the vaults before they put the bones and the skeletons and the coffins inside. So this is a virtual graveyard, Washington Square Park. It underwent a major renovation and facelifting around 2010. Hard to believe this spectacular arch was once defaced and graffitied in the 60s and the 70s during the anti-war movements of Vietnam, and cleaned up, and now the park is pristine, and it's one of the iconic places in New York. But not only in New York, I have people who come and visit and take our tours all the time from all over America and even outside of America who say, yes, we know the arch, we see it at home in France or in Germany or in Italy. So it's really an incredible sight, and it really denotes Washington Square Park and the center of the village, as does Fifth Avenue.
Yeah, but like if you...
So there was actually a doorway on the side, which we'll show you, where you used to be able to go in here. And inside there's beautiful tilings by the famed architect Raphael Gustafino, who also did the tilings in Ellis Island and in Grand Central Terminal and other places around New York. But it's spectacular on the outside and on the inside. A little bit about the history of the park. This is always, I said, we keep coming back to Washington Square Park. We keep coming back to the arch. Well, the Vietnam demonstrations. This is the epicenter of where the Vietnam War demonstrations took place in New York City and around the country. And the civil rights movement, racial equality, women's rights, the labor movement, gay rights. It all takes place in the West Village and in this area here. It always keeps coming back here. I mean, before there was a Bruce Springsteen, God love him, who makes his debut at the Cafe Wa many years ago at 16 years old in the afternoon, no alcohol being served, where Jimi Hendrix also played and where Bob Dylan also played. Before there was a Springsteen Born to Run or a Bruce Springsteen talking about the displaced steel worker, okay? There was, of course, Robert Allen Zimmerman, Mr. Dylan. And he does his first album, Bob Dylan, which didn't get good reviews. And Bob Dylan comes here from Hibbing, Minnesota as a 19-year-old, said he ran away from home 17 times, but they only caught him 16 times. And he comes here as a 19-year-old looking for his hero, Woody Guthrie. And he does meet him, and he does have an encounter with Woody Guthrie more than one occasion, but in a hospital in New Jersey. And he comes here on his first album. There are 3 original Bob Dylan songs. The others are covers to Woody Guthrie. Not well received, the first album, Bob Dylan. And they're going to can him, Columbia Records. But Johnny Cash becomes friends with the young Bob Dylan, puts his arm around him and tells Columbia, stay with this kid, he's got a lot of talent. So before any songs are laid down for the second album, Columbia says, let's keep him. Bob Dylan goes ahead and makes the groundbreaking, and it is groundbreaking, the freewheeling Bob Dylan. And that's a cover shot in this area. Bob Dylan's living in this area. And 13 songs on the album, 11 of them original Bob Dylan songs from a 21-year-old who writes Blowin' in the Wind. and a hard rain's going to fall, and don't think twice, it's all right. Amazing, amazing. Everyone agrees it's groundbreaking stuff, and that's the rise of Bob Dylan right there. And then the next album, the third one, is The Times They Are A-Changing. So we going backwards from Springsteen to Dylan. Now Dylan releases Blowin' in the Wind, as I mentioned, as a 21-year-old on the Freewheeling Bob Dylan, but he doesn't release it as a single. Now Peter, Paul, and Mary take it, they released it as a single, and it goes to #1. So Peter, Paul, and Mary now comes into the mix of singing civil rights songs and movements. Then of course we had Woody Guthrie, This Land Is Your Land, This Land Is My Land. And as with Woody Guthrie, we had Tom Paxton and Dave Van Ronk. Dave Van Ronk, by the way, was the man who his story was being told in the movie Inside Llewellyn Davis. And before Tom Paxton and Dave Van Ronk, of course, we had the father of American folk music, Pete Seeger, who in 1949 writes, If I Had a Hammer, the hammer signifying power. And it doesn't get recorded till 1955. And then the House Un-American Activities wants to give him a year in jail, which was overturned. But I mean, he's the father of American folk music. So it all comes back here. And the labor movement here in 1911, the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire Factory happened a few blocks over. 146 people died to their death, burned or jumped out windows. The next year on Labor Day in 1912, 20,000 people marched down Fifth Avenue and through the park in sake of the name of labor. And that was a game changer. That changed using child labor, sweatshops, 8-hour days. That was the game changer. And for civil rights, I Had a Hammer, incredible. Blowin' in the Wind took off all of this, and the Vietnam War. So it all comes back here. And using If I Had a Hammer as that song, and also Blowin' in the Wind, that's what was taken up in Montgomery and Selma, Alabama, when young people braved sitting at the lunch counters at the risk of being hit by fire hoses and police dogs. And they stayed there, and that was their song, Blowin' in the Wind. And If I Had a Hammer, this was what it was all about. And again, it all comes back here. The Bob Dylan New York roots coming to New York for Woody Guthrie being in New York City, and Tom Paxton and Dave Van Ronk and Peter, Paul, and Mary, who make their debut at the Village Gate, and at the bitter end, it always keeps coming back here. So it has a lot of history, this park, this arch, and we're really blessed to have this in New York City on a wonderful day like today to talk about this stuff. So we'll come right back. Okay, so we're looking northeast. The arch is now in front of me right now, out of sight. But if the area looks familiar, these beautiful Federal style and Greek Revival homes, if they look familiar, well, they're used in a lot of movies, and these are pricey homes. And number 14 over here was where Will Smith lived in I Am Legend. And down the block, the great artist Edward Hopper had his studio, and he also lived there. Edward Hopper, amongst other things, he's known for Nighthawks. And also Elizabeth Warren, okay? The Age of Innocence. She was the first woman to win a Pulitzer Prize for literature. So we've got a lot of history on this block, along with great architecture, and these homes lining this area just lead to the history, the beauty, and the culture of this area.
Good.
So one of the things I want to make particular historical note about is that underneath Manhattan, for centuries, there are many dozens, maybe even hundreds of brooks and creeks that ran under Manhattan, and some still do. And we're on a spot right now where the Minetta Creek, or the Minetta Brook, runs underneath here. It actually starts around 23rd Street, where the Flatiron Building comes down through the Village, goes into Soho, starts to go west, and empties into the Hudson River. Now, this was a major area, this area right here, besides being a cemetery right now, or a virtual cemetery, was a major area for the Lenape Indians. And the Lenape Indians were here before the Dutch came and before the British. The Lenape Indians fished in this area, in this park and in this area, going even south of where we are from Washington Square Park. But this area and south of this area. And this was a major area for fish, for game, and for fowl, for the Lenape Indians, one of the first inhabitants of this city over here. And they called it the Manatee River, M-A-N-N-E-T-T-E, Manatee, which which meant devil's water. We call it Minetta now. We've anglicized it, if that's a word, and we've called it the Minetta Creek or the Minetta Brook, but they called it the Manatee Creek, and which meant devil's water. Then the Dutch later on called it the Little Creek, but it runs underneath here. So a lot of this area is hollow underneath here, and we have footage of it, which we show on our tour, and we have stops on our tour where we'll actually show you the Minetta Brook as it is today in 2017, running underneath Washington Square Park and running underneath Minetta Lane and running through Tribeca. So we have those photos, and it's a wonderful thing to see that the Indians and the Lenape Indians used to fish, shoot game, and fowl in this park, in this area, and south and below here. So we're going to show you that. Also, if the park looks familiar, Hollywood loves this park. Many movies were shot here. I mean, when Harry Met Sally, where Fifth Avenue ends, there's that famous shot of Billy Crystal and Meg Ryan come. They make a right turn off of Fifth Avenue, a right turn. Billy Crystal gets out, he holds his baseball bats under his arm, and he insists that men and women can never be friends. And he walks through the arch, and there, the two towers in the background, God rest their soul. You've got Searching for Bobby Fischer, August Rush, The Freshman with Marlon Brando. You've got a young Matthew Broderick walking through the park here. Years ago, a young Redford and Fonda in barefoot in the park. And it goes on and it goes on. During that construction period that ended in approximately 2010, we see our fountain in the background here. Well, they moved the fountain so they can center it, that it would be in sync, in view with the arch. So our fountain here was actually relocated. An unnecessary task, most people agree, myself, but they centered it so you can look through the arch and see the fountain at the same time. But the Minetta Brook, or the Manatee Brook as the Indians called it, the Manatee Creek, Devil's Water, and the Dutch called it the Little Creek, runs underneath here. And on our full tour, which is about 2.5 to 3 hours, we show you the creek, we show you the brook, along with a lot of other places like where Bob Dylan lived, Bob Dylan album covers, Bob Dylan stomping grounds, recording studios, and other little mews and alleyways and places that were around before cars were here, where horse and buggy and horse and carriage were dominating this area. About a great building here. We're on Minetta Street, where Minetta Lane and Minetta Street meet. This is 17 Minetta Street, and this just went on the market and was sold. I think it went over 20 million. Very plain, not very fancy or ornate building from the outside, but what a spectacular building. You walk inside over here, you walk through the mews, and then you go to the right. If you can see that through the fence, you go to the right, and there's another private garden, and that's how you enter in the back over here, one of the entrances. It's got a little bit of everything. First of all, it looks like it's inviting. It looks like you know a little bit about it, but yet you can't get in, okay? It doesn't tell you much of a story. It's mysterious. And you have no idea that in the background there, you can see the background of the old carriage house buildings facing us. Here you go through the mews here, and then there's the wall there, and you open that gate, and there's a private background over there. And it's a spectacular building, and very much renovated, on the market, a federal-style building, $20 million. And this is the place where you're no traffic, no noise, no cars, and you're at the intersection of Minetta Lane and Minetta. We're in front of the Cafe Wa, and we talked earlier about a young Bruce Springsteen as a teenager, 16 years old, playing afternoons only, no alcohol. Okay, he was a member of the Castiles. 16-year-old Bruce plays a couple of songs, no alcohol, children only, and that's where Bruce gets his first gig as a 16-year-old. But Jimi Hendrix played here, and so did Mr. Dylan. As a matter of fact, there's a reference on his first album, the unheralded album, Bob Dylan, where there's a line in one of his songs, "I'm blowing my brains out for like $1 a night," and he's talking about this place where he's not getting paid, and he's singing and playing the harmonica. So Mr. Dylan plays here, along with Bill Cosby and Joan Rivers and so many people who are from that era of Lenny Bruce and so many people. But music-wise, we're talking right now specifically, we're talking about Mr. Dylan and Robert Allen Zimmerman in the beginning, and we're talking about a young Bruce Springsteen. Still in business, still in the same location, the Cafe Wa, legendary. It's on our tour, it's on our 2.5 hour, 3 hour tour. Watch yourself.